All right. Well, I'll kick it off. We're 2 minutes past time. So thank you everyone that's attending. I'm incredibly excited to well actually just sit in and learn from Sean on this presentation. And I've known Sean for 4 or 5 years now. Incredibly accomplished business owner, venture capitalist, Kellogg MBA professor. Every time I get time with Sean, I just like soak it up, because I love his approach to um, work, business, relationships, life. He's a family man. You can just tell if you follow him on his social presence what a kind of pillar of his family and community he is. So I actually personally went through. He has a course called Building an Intentional Life. It's a cohort that I've been a part of, and it just walks through a framework for how to approach your career, how to build a life that you love. So I've really enjoyed being a part of the things Sean is putting out in the world, and I'm excited for him to kind of do this presentation today. So with that, I'll toss it over to you, Sean. And
Yeah, man. Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for everybody for joining this. It's we're gonna fly. We have a lot of material to kind of go through. So I apologize in advance. The webinar is being recorded, and I am available to answer questions or kind of dig into more detail after the fact. So if you don't catch everything, that's okay, but I want to provide as much value as I can with the time that we have together. So this is an idea called the personal operating system. And just for context, a little bit about myself. My life vision, I guess you could say, is to try to help people build more intentional businesses and live more intentional lives. And these days, what that looks like is, Luke mentioned, I run a group program twice a year. It's a 6-week program. And then I'll sometimes do some one-on-one stuff with folks as well. And then on the side, not on the side, my main thing is I'm working on building up what they call a personal holding company, and starting with a firm for professional services that does marketing for them. But my background was as the last 12 years, I was a founding partner at Manifold, which is a venture holding company in Chicago, has an enterprise consulting arm and a venture investing arm. And then for 9 years, I taught digital marketing at Kellogg as well. As Luke mentioned, I tend to think about all of this stuff in the context of like how to build an intentional life. And this is basically the model that I use for all of it. And there's 3 main problems that I've identified that folks have that prevent them from living a more intentional life. One is they don't have a clear vision. That was certainly true for me for a big part of my life. They don't know how to get there, or they lack kind of the systems that they need to kind of make it actually happen. And so what I did with Luke and what I do with other people is we articulate what I call a 10-year vision that's in alignment with our values and is meant to create a more meaningful story out of our lives. We then create vision plans that kind of make those things real. A lot of times people cast big, hairy, audacious visions, but they don't know how to get from here to there. And so we get specific and we talk about like, what are the skills I need to have, the relationships I need to have, the beliefs I need to have about myself and about the world to make that happen. And then what are some intermediate milestones that can get me there? And then lastly is, in order to translate all that into like my day-to-day life, I need an operating system. And there's a habit piece to that. There's what I call task management, relationship management, knowledge management piece to that. And then there's an operating cadence in terms of how I move through my days, weeks, months, quarters, and years. And what we're going to focus our energy on today is this piece, the task, relationship, and knowledge management piece. And why do you need all of this? Just to give you some context on when I started working on this in my previous life, as I mentioned, I was a founding partner at an enterprise consulting firm. We had 10, 15 clients going on at any given time. We had 80 employees. I also was a GP at a venture fund, and we had 25 investments that we had done. At any point in time, numerous of them were on fire. And so trying to help them out. As I mentioned, I was teaching at Kellogg at the same time. My wife is a chief revenue officer at an investment bank that's growing rapidly and is owned by a PE fund. She's also runs a nonprofit that has 600 members in it. And then on top of that, we have 2 kids that are 10 and 13 with all of the stuff associated with that. And we want to take care of our bodies, and we want to have deep relationships with friends and family, and, right? And so that was the what was going on in my life at the time when I started really trying to articulate all of this was like, I need a system to prevent me from imploding. If I build a great business, but I implode, it's kind of all for nothing. And so I needed something that allowed me to think about this a little bit more holistically. And the context of this session, as we said, is for high growth founders. That's probably a similar situation for you. So just thinking about you in the business context, depending on the stage of startup that you have or the stage of business you have, like you are responsible for casting the vision and deciding the strategy. You're responsible for going out and talking to early customers and trying to validate if there's a there. You're responsible for developing the first version of the product, most likely. You're responsible for getting those first customers and doing all the marketing activities associated with it. You have to go out and fundraise, and you have to recruit and hire your team, and you have to deal with operations, and you have to be the decider when your team has a bunch of kind of intractable problems, and you have to be the person to at least be aware of and have good financial controls around the business so that you don't run out of money. You have to start thinking about risk management as you grow, strategic partnerships as you grow, legal and compliance. That's a lot. And then on top of that, that's just your job. And that doesn't even touch on all of the other aspects of your life. And if you have a family, that, you know, everything that your family is carrying. And so it's really easy to see why, left to our own devices, we tend to gravitate toward work stuff, because all of these people are yelling at you in a way that, like, maybe your partner isn't yelling at you, or your kids aren't yelling at you, or your family isn't yelling at you, or your own self, your body isn't yelling at you until it's kind of too late to do anything about it. And so we want to have a system that allows us to be productive in our companies and to make progress in our business, and cultivate all these relationships and all those kinds of things, but also have our personal lives be whole and coherent and integrated as well. And so that's kind of the goal behind all of this. As I mentioned, the three pieces that we're talking about today are the task management, knowledge management, and relationship management. These are the three systems that I think at a day-to-day level allow me to be on top of everything consistently, to pursue deeper, more meaningful relationships consistently, and to continually level up in my skills consistently. And if you put all of those three things together, you become progressively better as an operator and as a CEO or as a founder. You attract better investor talent, team members, personal relationships get better. And then on a day-to-day basis, like, you're able to translate that big vision that you have for your company into more intermediate objectives and make consistent progress. And if you model this as an executive, I have found that your team tends to pick up some of these habits from you as well, and it elevates your whole team together. So that's what we're going to focus on. Starting with task management. So there are three reasons why we don't move forward on things. The first one is that we haven't clarified what done means. So you have a lot of amorphous stuff in your head, and you don't know if you're done or not, right? The other one is we don't know what to do next. We don't know what the next physical thing is that I need to do to move this project or to move this initiative forward. Or we don't track it all in a system that our brain can trust. And so we end up thinking about things when we shouldn't be thinking about things. We're worrying about things when we shouldn't be worrying about things. And we don't have a comprehensive inventory of everything that's going on in our work and in our lives. And so we drop balls. Things don't get the appropriate attention at the appropriate time, and all of that kind of thing. And so task management kind of solves for this. There's two key disciplines that are inherent in this system. The first is what I call outcome thinking. And the idea there is getting really clear on what done looks like to start. So whenever we start a new project, whenever we start a new initiative, ourselves or with our team, we get in the habit of saying, what does done mean? And you've probably been in projects where that wasn't clear. And by not clearly defining it, you end up spinning your wheels. You end up doing a lot of false starts. You end up having to redo a lot of work. Projects die on the vine. Projects are much more inefficient than they could otherwise be. And at a personal level too. I mean, I use David Allen's definition of project, which is basically anything in your life, personally or professionally, that takes more than one step to complete. And so by that definition, you probably have a lot of projects going on at any given time. A lot of them are personal projects and a lot of them are professional projects. So getting clear on what done means, I think, is the first kind of essential discipline. The second one is like, what does amazing look like? And so I have found, again, thinking about that larger model about creating meaningful stories, creating a meaningful business, designing better products, having more life-giving client engagements, having better relationships. A lot of this kind of stuff can be defined just by getting in the habit of at the beginning saying, like, what would amazing look like? So what would an amazing webinar look like? What would the next one-on-one I'm having with a team member, what would amazing look like? The annual team strategic planning sessions that we're doing, what would an amazing version of that look like? What would an amazing birthday party for my daughter look like? Getting in the habit of just asking that question interrupts your brain and opens up opportunities to ask questions about yourself that you might not have otherwise asked, and to create more compelling, more interesting stories, both in a personal context and in a professional context. The other main habit is next outcome thinking. So the first one is outcome thinking. The next one is next action thinking. And so a lot of the stuff, most people, when I talk about the idea of like task management, they sometimes will bristle because they're like, I have a to-do list. I'm a functional adult. How dare you suggest that I am not thinking about this the way I should? But if you look at their lists, a lot of their lists look like this, like mom's birthday. Like, what does mom's birthday mean? It's a big question. Like, and by not getting clarity on what done means for this and not getting clarity on what the next thing I need to do to move it forward, it's just an amorphous blob that takes up kind of psychic space that it doesn't need to take up. And so we want to get in the habit of turning stuff like this into throw an amazing 70th birthday for mom. What does done look like? A reservation at Gibson's for a private room with 20 of her friends and family, with a book of letters from people that she cares about, right? So like asking what would an amazing 70th birthday look like prompts me to think about like, what if there's an artifact I could give her that would be more meaningful and more compelling, right? And then what's the next action? Call dad and get a list of 20, 30 people I can contact about the party, right? Now I know what this is. I know what done means, and I know what the next thing is I need to do to move it forward. And if you can do this across all of the aspects of your professional and personal life, you are much more likely to move many, many more things forward than you otherwise would. And if any of you are a part of organizations where you have direct reports, if they were to get in the habit of doing this too, and if you could teach them how to do this by modeling and by coaching them, think about how much more effective your organization would become. And if you can do this consistently, you become the person for whom balls do not drop, and the person whom other people can kind of rely on you to consistently move things forward and consistently create better outputs as a result too. So that's what we're trying to do. So there's 3 steps to doing this. The first is to collect everything, to get everything out of your head, right? And get it into a system that you can trust. And so in the coaching thing, I talk about this idea of a brain dump. You basically go through all of your stuff, personal and professional, and you write it down and you get it out of your head. I do this also during a weekly review meeting as well with myself or with my partner. But once I've done that, then I process it. And processing, this is very heavily influenced by GTD, if anybody's familiar with that. But basically, the process goes like, for this next thing that has shown up in my inbox, right? Is there anything I need to do about this? The answer might be yes, the answer might be no. If the answer is no, there's a couple of reasons why. It might be that I don't need to do anything about it ever, in which case I can probably delete it. It might be something that I don't need to do anything about right now, which means I can archive it or put it in some sort of a reference system. It might be something that I need to do in 2 weeks, in which case I'm deferring it. And maybe I park it in my calendar or something like that, or a tickler file. So that's the things that I don't need to move on right now. For things that I do, I ask myself, is this something that I can do in 2 minutes? In which case I just do it. And if it's not something I can do in 2 minutes, I ask myself if it's a project or if it's a single task. If it's a single task, I put it in a single tasks list. If it's a project, I define what the project is. I take a second to define what done means. I ask myself, what would amazing look like? And then I identify what the next physical action is to move that forward. So as a result of, and as a result of that, I've got kind of a comprehensive list of all of the next things that I need to do. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like in just a second. The last step is review. And that is, if I put stuff in a system, but I don't develop the discipline to review the system at the appropriate cadence, then I don't trust the system. My brain doesn't trust the system, and I'm not going to use it consistently. And the example that David Allen likes to give is think about your calendar. Your brain has learned to trust your calendar for time-based events, right? You're not constantly asking yourself, where do I need to be at a certain time? Because you've outsourced that to your calendar to do that, to park that for you. And so now you trust your calendar. The idea is to do the same thing with every other part of your life that are not just time or date specific events, right? And so the mechanism that you use for that is a weekly review. And when I talk about like the idea of like an operating cadence, I have other horizons that I look at. I have a monthly review, a quarterly review, an annually review. They happen during my weekly review slot. And it's really just like, what horizon am I looking at? But the weekly review is when I kind of do an inventory of all of my open loops and all of my open projects and my next actions. And I ask myself, is there anything I need to be moving forward on this week? Is there anything that used to be true, but is no longer true? Is there new stuff that has popped up in my inbox in the last week? And what do I need to do about that? And it's basically an opportunity, usually takes an hour or so, to just get current and get clear on my life. So what does that look like? I use a tool called Things. This is a hypothetical example for a founder of some of the, and you can see here, I've got my inbox. I just drop things into here as it comes up. One of the things I really like about, and I'll caveat all of this with, I'm going to be showing you my tools. I am not prescriptive about the tools you use. My wife uses paper still, and it works great for her. I am a tech person, and so I gravitate toward pretty tools. And I found a higher correlation with me using them if it's something that I enjoy. And so I use Things because I think it's pretty and it makes me happy to use it. But you can see here, it has a section called an inbox, and this is where I just drop things in as they come in. This isn't where I work out of, though. My goal is to process this. So, and one of the things I like about Things is it has a keyboard shortcut where if I'm working on a deck or I'm I'm doing something else, and somebody mentioned something, I hit the keyboard shortcut, a little box pops up, I drop something at my inbox, I get back right to what I was doing. I can do the same thing on my phone. It has a native iOS app, native Android app as well. And so I have a quick keyboard short, or a whatever they call those things, widget on my home thing. It drops something in my inbox, and then I can get back to what I'm doing. So you can see these are somewhat amorphous. So like mom's birthday, call back Danny, right? Like I don't necessarily know what those things mean yet. But you see on the left-hand side, I've got a list of example projects, and I like to organize them by my work and my personal. Different people have different approaches. Again, it's very flexible in terms of how you set this up. But a project could be attend some such and such trade show, or launch our new onboarding process, or expand our engineering team, or draft the budget for next year. But you can also see at a personal level, plan family vacation, set up home workout space, right? You can have the average person has somewhere between 30 and 100 projects going on at any given time. Again, if you define a project as anything that takes more than 2 steps to complete, that probably makes sense to you about why that would be. The idea of having that is daunting when people first think about it, but I encourage you to think about, like, you have 30 to 100 projects going on right now. You just maybe haven't written them down, right? And so what's happening is they're taking up space in your head. They're creating unnecessary stress or unnecessary angst for you. And by clarifying them and getting them out of your head into a system that you reliably will trust and use, you're going to free up some of your headspace and alleviate a lot of that stress that you might be feeling, because you have this nagging sense of some stuff that you need to be doing that you're not currently moving on. So single task actions, I keep in a project that I call miscellaneous tasks. Again, different tools have different ways of approaching this. This is how I do it. And you can see here, I can attach a context to each of these things. So I can have errands or calls or computer or whatever it is. And the idea is that when it comes time to do stuff, I can reduce the scope by thinking about the context that I'm in. And so, for example, if I'm in an Uber downtown or something like that, and I have 30 minutes, I probably can't do any of the things that I would do on my computer, but I can make some phone calls and I can get that done. If I'm running some errands, I'm probably not working on my computer, right? Some people will have things by like home or work contexts, right? I make heavy use of what I call agendas. So I have agendas for my wife. I have agendas for my kids. I have agendas for my directs. I have agendas for my partners, all of those kinds of things as well. But I keep single task actions in one bucket, and then everything else looks like a project like this. And so for every project, you want to have at least one physical next action that you can take to move it forward. I often will drop more in there. As you can see here, an example of sending a monthly investor letter. I have four example things in here. But you want to have at least one next action that you can work on to kind of move it forward, right? And again, this works at a personal level as well as a professional level. So this would be an example of planning my family vacation. What ends up happening with this is I do two things. One, during my weekly review, I identify what I call my MVT, or my most vital task. And that is, what is, of this inventory of projects and inventory of next actions I have, what is the most important one that I want to work on today? And during my weekly review, I slot these into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And for me, I try to do it when my energy is highest, which for me is between like 8:30 and 11:30. And I carve out a 2 to 3 hour block to focus on the most important thing I need to get done that day. And my belief on this is that, one, there's data now to suggest that the average person can only do between 2 and 4 hours of deep work in a typical day. They cannot sustain that pace throughout the whole day. And so I want to recognize those constraints. I can't do 8 to 10 hours of deep work every single day, but I can do 2 to 3 hours. And so I want to make sure I carve out the time to do that and minimize the number of distractions, notifications, et cetera, I have during that time. And then in the afternoon, I can load that up with meetings, phone calls, administrative stuff, whatever it is, and trust that even if the whole rest of my day gets blown up, I got my most important thing done each day. And so those activities, I'll have 1 to 3, at most 3. And usually it's like one deep work one, and then a couple of like things I need to get back to, or things that would unlock other people. So getting in the habit of, if you have direct reports, thinking about leverage, I think is a key skill. So for example, like my all hands meeting with my team would be an example of a most vital task, because I know that a great all hands meeting unlocks a month's worth of productivity for everybody on my team. Your one-on-ones, I think, can be the same way. Your staff meetings can be the same way. I think a lot of people think of those kinds of meetings as administrative tasks, and they don't give them the strategic importance that I think that they can give them. If you start to think about it in terms of leverage, you know, my weekly one-on-one unlocks a week of productivity for that person, right? And so if I have my 8 one-on-ones in a day, I tried to batch them. Let's say I have 8 one-on-ones for my 8 directs. I've unlocked 40 times 100, 40 times 8, whatever that is, 320 hours of productivity by having good productive one-on-ones. And so that would be an example of a most vital task. But I have at most 3. And then the rest of the time I live in this anytime section. And this is an inventory, again, of all of the next actions I have across all of my projects. And I can scope them again by context. And that allows me to kind of focus in and get things done. And I can be like, hey, I have 15 minutes here. What can I get done? What can I pick off from this list given those 15 minutes? I have a lot of energy, or I have low energy. What's a task I can do given relatively low amount of energy, right? What is something, again, that'd be another opportunity to look at leverage. What's something that would unlock some time for other people? Maybe I tick that off first before I focus on some of my own things. But I don't live on this project list. I'm not constantly reevaluating the projects list. I try to save that as much as possible for my weekly review. And I try to live inside of today and inside of any time as much as I can. That allows me to consistently be productive and consistently move the things forward that I want to move forward. I don't know. Oh, that's just an example of context. So this is another context called waiting for. You have a lot of things that you're waiting on from other people. I try to get in the habit of adding those into my system as well, and just tagging it as waiting for versus trying to remember to follow up with people. And so I have an inventory of all the things I'm waiting for on, and often you can batch that as well. The missing link I found in most task management pieces of software is actually project support material. They don't have support for that. And so I use Notion for that. And so for all of like the open projects I have going on, personal and professional, I have checklists and projects that I use for that. And so for, I'm working on a customer experience course right now. And so I manage all of that in here. For at a personal level, we throw a Thanksgiving party for 30 or 40 of our friends every year. I have a project that I manage inside of that in here. All the support material for that lives inside of here. But having support material and getting in the habit of whenever you spin up a project, spinning up a corresponding page in Notion or some other type of tool that is kind of the repository for all of your support materials that kind of live behind that, allows you to have your task management tool be about the specific tasks that you're trying to accomplish, while your project support material is all of the supporting material that you need to kind of live in there. And so I use Notion just because it's pretty and it's very flexible. I like the icons, they make me happy. And so that's how I use it. But again, the tool doesn't matter, whatever works for you and whatever works for your organization is great. So that's task management. The second system is knowledge management. And this is, again, when I'm trying to level up.
One question.
Yeah, sure.
For everyone attending, we got one question about if there will be a recording. There will be a recording. We'll send it around afterwards. It's to the email that when you registered on the LinkedIn event that you put in, or that was just tied to your LinkedIn. So if that's like an old email, if you also, I just sent connection requests to everyone that that RSVP'd. So if you also connect, I can DM the recording to you afterwards. And then I think lastly, we scheduled this for only 30 minutes. I think you have more material to go over. What do you just for an expectation setting for people? What do you think? Like
15 minutes, maybe?
I think that's perfect.
Yeah. So the next one is knowledge management. And this is a lot of the things that you're trying to do require leveling up in your skill set. And it also speaks to the idea of like, we're all kind of drowning in information, and you probably are consuming a lot of content, but most of it kind of comes in one ear and leaves the other, and you just lose it. And if I read something useful, but I don't have a way to incorporate it into my life, it's not ultimately helpful for me. And so knowledge management is the process of capturing and making use of that information to help me level up in my career, acquire skill sets, help my team, all of that kind of thing. So there's 4 steps I have for this. First is reading. Obviously you're ingesting a bunch of stuff. It comes at you in a bunch of different ways. I want to capture it in some way. And so there's, again, formats vary. Ryan Holiday, who's written a lot of books around like stoicism and all that kind of stuff, is a big believer in using index cards. He captures one idea per card and he keeps them in these big files. It feels bulky to me. I've tried it. It doesn't work for me. I'm, again, a technology person. There's a lot of tools that have come out in the last few years that all take advantage of this idea of bidirectional linking. And bidirectional linking basically allows you to link topics together. Rome Research is one of them. Obsidian is another. This one is called Reflect. And I like it again because it's prettier than the other two. And so that's why I use it. But I drop my book notes in here. I drop notes from phone calls in here. I try to take advantage of like linking different things so you can see like this is a book about boards. So I tie it into the other material that I have around boards. And so I capture all of my notes in here. It also is really cool because it automatically creates pages from my Kindle. And so if I highlight notes in my Kindle, it will automatically create a page for that book and it will populate it with all of my highlights, which is I really like a lot. And again, I do it in a professional context. I also do it in a personal context. I want to improve my back strength and flexibility. So like, this is another thing. And then the other one that I use is Readwise Reader. And so for people who are familiar with like Pocket, something like that, Readwise is again, just a prettier one that I like. And what it allows me to do is save articles for later. And I try to batch my reading. So I have an hour each weekend where I have to read and go through my Readwise. And as I highlight stuff, it again syncs directly with Reflect and drops my stuff in there and associates it with that article. And so this allows me to capture and take insights from all of this stuff. But the next step is arguably the more important one. And that's where I take all of this stuff and I try to summarize it. So you can see here as an example, I've read several books about how to be a good board member. I take that and I translate it into kind of what I call a unified theory document. I used to do that in Reflect. I now do it actually in Notion. And the reason why I do it in Notion is because I have found, again, it's pretty, but it's helpful for me, but more importantly, it's helpful for other people too. And so once I have a document like on product strategy or on boards, or there's one on personal holding companies that I've shared probably 24 times in the last couple of months, just because it seems to be resonating with a lot of people. It allows me to create, you see a little share button up at the top there. It allows me to create a public facing version of this page that I can now share with my team, with my co-founders, with friends that are interested in topics, with people that I network with in meetings and things like that. And so it makes it a lot more valuable. But it allows me to basically say, of all the stuff that I've read about how to be better at thinking about products, what's the most salient stuff? And so I try to keep and maintain these like unified theory documents that are kind of summaries of the knowledge that I've been capturing about a particular topic. And so I have them for personal stuff like how to deal with anxiety, philosophy, financial management, how to raise good kids, all of that kind of stuff. But then I also have it for any of the areas or skills that I'm trying to level up in my career. So that could be marketing, it could be sales, it could be strategic partnerships, it could be fundraising, it could be any of those kinds of things. And so doing the job of synthesizing, I feel like forces me, I found that if I highlight something and then I don't look at it again, my retention is very poor. If I go through the work of a couple weeks after reading a book, consolidating those notes into a summarized version of it, my retention skyrockets. Same thing if I take all of my disparate notes and combine it into a unified theory document, my retention skyrockets. One other tool that's really helpful though is creating a cadence for review. And the tool I really like to use, at least from a book notes perspective, is Readwise, because it sends me an email each morning with 5 highlights from the stuff that I've read. And so I just can go through them. And if it serves me, great. If it stops to serve me, then I can discard it. If I want to increase the cadence in which it shows up, I can change the cadence, but that's really helpful for me from a retention perspective as well. It's scoped only to my Kindle highlights, unfortunately, or things that I've highlighted in my Readwise reader. So it misses certain like physical books and things like that. But it's a really helpful retention tool for me as well. But then the last part of this is like applying it. So again, I make heavy use of Notion. Anytime somebody asks me something twice, how to do something twice, anytime I have to do something multiple times, I try to document it in a standard operating procedure. And that works for me at a personal level or a professional level. And again, it summarizes this knowledge and then applies it and makes it practical. So this is an example of a marketing and sales audit. At Manifold, we would do this. When I would do diligence on venture investments, we would do this. And so it incorporates a whole bunch of different things, right? So like ideal customer profile, that's a topic that I probably read about at one point. What's the revenue model stuff? That's probably a topic that I read about at one point. This is taking all of that and synthesizing it and putting it into a single document that's very actionable that I can use, or my direct reports can use, or friends of mine that have this problem can use, and I can share it with them. And it allows me to take all of this ephemeral knowledge or ethereal knowledge or hypothetical knowledge and make it tangible and make it more applicable. So that's knowledge management. The last one is relationship management. And I've been a big believer in relationships for a long time. This is one of my favorite authors from back in the day, Tom Peters. Everybody knows they should network, but they're not necessarily as good about it as they could be. And I'll skip this. The idea at a life level, for me, my life KPI is what I call funeral-worthy relationships. And the basic question is, how do I invest in people such that when I die, they drop what they're doing and they fly across the country to be in my funeral? That's the question that I ask. And how do I go about doing that in a sustainable and a scalable way? There are some people who just do it naturally and they don't need a system. I can't keep it all in my head. I'm not capable of doing it. And so I use these tools admittedly as crutches because I have to. You might be able to do it without a system, but for everybody else, this is how I go about doing this and maximizing this. First idea, I got this from a friend of mine who I always have said is the best networker I've ever met, who ironically has always asked to remain nameless, but he managed it all in a spreadsheet, and he had a spreadsheet that had 5 names, 25 names, and 150 names on it. And the 5 names he would try to keep in touch with multiple times a week. The 25 names he would keep in touch with weekly, and then the 150 names monthly. I can't sustain that pace. I do it. I try to do 5 weekly, 25 monthly, 150 quarterly. But the idea is, the really unique insight that he had was the 5 names are not the people that would be most helpful to him or his career. They were the people that he could help the most. And the idea was that if I could make a material investment in this person's life because they got a new job, they're needing to raise money, they lost a job, they just had a kid, they just lost a kid, they have a health scare, any of those kinds of things, how can he materially show up for these people above and beyond what people would normally expect? And if you do that for 5 people a month or 5 people a quarter or even 5 people a year, and you project that out over 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, the difference that you would make on those people's lives would be material. And so I've always loved that idea. And so I can't maintain his cadence as he's super aggressive with it. He basically lives in that spreadsheet, but I have my own version. I try to model that as well. So you think about like, who would your 150 be, right? Obviously your internal team, potential talent. We talked about recruiting being one of the key jobs of a CEO, right? Bringing in new talent and attracting new talent. And so having a pipeline of potential people that you might hire at some point in the future and keeping in touch with them is a key skill. Your investors, both your current investors as well as prospective investors, just because they said no today doesn't mean they're going to say no the next time around. And so having a cadence for following up with those people is super valuable. Obviously clients, prospective clients, strategic partners, advisors, family, friends, all of that kind of stuff. You get to 150 actually relatively quickly. So how do you do it? This is a guy named Harvey McKay. He runs an envelope company in Minnesota. He's written a bunch of books. Most of them came out in the 80s, but he had this thing called the McKay 66 that he had all of his salespeople do. And it was a paper dossier of each of their client accounts that had 66 discrete pieces of information on it. So it was like your name, where you went to school, your wife's or husband's name or partner's name, your anniversary, the kids' names, the kids' ages, the kids' birthdays. Were you in the military? If so, did you like the military or hate it? You know, you don't bring it up if they hated it or whatever it was, but it was all these different pieces of information. And then they would leverage that to build relationship and to build rapport with people over time, because we know in a sales context, for example, you have to have an average of 27 touches in order to close a sale. And so the question is like, what in the world do I say 27 times? And so like, that's the fodder for a lot of that kind of stuff. And I'll show you some examples of how you can apply it in a second. This is the tool I use for managing my relationships. It's called Dex. You can see here, this is an example of like, if I had a VC, if I'm raising money or I'm preparing to raise money, I would keep track of my, my VC relationships in here as an example. You can see you track notes for them like a typical CRM. You can have reminders that you set up. But you can also do it. I do it for my professional relationships, but also for my personal ones. And so when I pop in each morning, I see the people that I needed to follow up with quarterly, or monthly or weekly who show up that day, they show up in here. Reminders of like friends' birthdays or their kids' birthdays show up in here. Anniversaries show up in here. Things that I committed to do coming off of a phone call show up in here. And so it allows me, when I come in, on average, there's between like 3 and 7, I would say, people in my life that I want to follow up with or speak into in some way. And it can be a simple text message. It could be sending them a book. It can be, these anniversaries are great opportunities to do that. One of the people that's in the current coaching cohort mentioned on today's call, actually, that their wife sends a birthday note each year, but they say, what was the highlight of the last year? What are you most looking forward to this year? And what's a big goal that you want to accomplish? And so like when we talk about, again, funeral-worthy relationships, like they took a simple thing like a birthday note and they turned it into this opportunity to connect and build a deeper relationship with people. And so this is how I manage it. So it's not super overwhelming. I did it the wrong way. First, I tried to input all 150 of them and set the cadence at the same time. So it set it up where like 100 people would show up once a quarter or whatever it was. So that was unsustainable. So I ended up going in and like staggering them, which helped out a ton. Another tip on birthdays, I found I have the announcement come out, or the trigger show up like the day before the birthday, because a lot of people will post on Twitter or Facebook or whatever is happy birthday to my kid or my partner or whatever it is. And so I send them a note the day before and just say, hey, it's Olive's birthday coming up this weekend. You have any fun plans for them? And they're like, oh, wow, that's great. So that's a tip for you. But that's how I do it. And then some ways to keep in touch. Well, obviously texting, sending them articles is super helpful. Organizing dinners. I'm a big fan. I call it the 3-hour dinner. So it's like get a group of 4 or 5 people together, You let them know why I specifically chose them. And you start the meeting off, you say, hey, here's this person. This is why I invited them. This is why I thought you all would hit it off. You introduce them, and then you let them go and you just sit and you enjoy the time together. The next day, you send them a text message with the contact info for each of the 4 or 5 people. This is a huge just gift that you can give to people if you do it relatively consistently. If you're comfortable, you can start to throw parties. So I have a friend named Nick Gray who wrote a book that's really great called The 2-Hour Cocktail Party. The guy in the middle is a guy from one of my previous cohorts. His name's Jeff. He moved to Phoenix. He wanted to invest in relationships, and he read that book and he took advantage of it, and he started throwing parties, and now he knows a whole bunch of people. For anybody that has moved or is an adult, you know how hard it can sometimes be to build adult friend relationships. And so being the organizer can be huge. You know, I mentioned we do an annual Thanksgiving party. I also do a movie night with people in my neighborhood where we go and we go watch the new Marvel movie or whatever. I do an annual dads and kids camping trip each year that's coming up in October. And it's now like 12 dads and 20 some kids, and it's total chaos. But just looking for opportunities to kind of bring people together and to kind of be that hub can be a huge thing. And this is where some of the synergies come into play. So like I mentioned, the knowledge management stuff. I learned over the last couple of years that my notes can be helpful to other people. And so I started progressively migrating those coordinated things into Notion. So whenever somebody has that question, or I mention it in a talk, or I mention it over coffee, and they're like, oh, that sounds interesting. Sending them the book is great, but sending them your consolidated, like super actionable notes about that topic is even better. And so I keep all of that stuff in Notion, and it allows me to do that. Same thing with like your projects. So like on the task management side, I mentioned project support material, right? I took my kids to Paris. I made a whole itinerary for it. Previous me, when the trip was done, I would close that project and this would just disappear. What I realized is that there's a really good chance other people are going to go to Paris at some point, or going to take their kids or whatever it is. And so I keep these in an archived projects section. And then someone mentions they're going to Paris. I'm like, oh, do you want my itinerary? I had a whole like 9-day thing. And they're like, oh yeah, that'd be great. Or, hey, we did an estate plan. Like, do you want, you mentioned that you need to plan your estate. Like, hey, let me send you the process that we went through. And so you think about like over time, again, over 5 years, 10 years, or whatever it is, and all the projects that you've done and all your unified theory documents that you've done, you now have ways to be super helpful to people on a consistent basis. One of the things I've been doing on LinkedIn is posting standard operating procedures and things like that I've built up over the years. And again, this is just exhaust from you moving your projects forward and you reading and kind of synthesizing information kind of in your own context, but it can become a way to build deeper relationships and to be as helpful to people as possible over an extended period of time. And so getting in the habit of not just storing these for yourself, but also storing them from other people can be super helpful too. A couple other examples. This is a page I have of like ways to love people. So like books I can send at various times. Gifts I can send them at various periods of time. Sometimes people share it on social, not always, but it's neat, to see that actually like impacted people in some way. And I actually identify books like this. I keep one of them in my book, like in my dresser or my bookshelf by my desk at any given time, so that when it happens, I can quickly wrap it, write a quick note, drop it in the mail, and then it goes off to them. Referrals as well. Building up a list of doctors, accountants, financial planners, attorneys, therapists, any of those kinds of things can be another way to be a value added for people. And so I keep those in a consolidated place so that whenever somebody mentions something, I can just real quickly grab that referral and send it over to them. So that's relationship management. And those are the 3 elements of the system. I know I covered a tremendous amount of material. I'm available. I can continue to answer questions for folks. But just real quick in terms of next steps, if you're interested in some of the support documents for some of these things, send me a DM on LinkedIn and I'll send them your way. So like the brain dump I mentioned, the weekly review I mentioned, a version of the McKay 66 I mentioned. If you want personal holding company or whatever it is, again, like I've got 100 of these things at this point. But I will be happy to send some of the support material that can help you make some of this stuff more actionable, or some of the tools that I use. Just send me a DM on LinkedIn. And then, like Luke mentioned, I do this 6-week thing. The next one is going to be in January. So we do it around the new year. But if that's interesting to you, you can go to my website, which is just sean-johnson.com, and you can get on the list for the next cohort. And I'll reach out to you probably around December with next steps and what that would look like. But that's it. I'm available for questions that folks might have.
Man, that was great. The content's just so good every time. I think I've been monitoring the Q&A and just answering a few that came through, but I left a few of them up here. So if I don't know if you see it, or if I should just read them off to you.
Let me see if I can figure out how to open that up. Okay, yeah. How do you balance spending time on setup and day-to-day aspects of personal relationship management for maximizing value? So I think of this, again, I talked about this idea of leverage. You're right that it takes time to set up. So to add a new contact, especially if it's somebody that I have a lot of info on, so like populating their anniversaries, populating their birthdays and things like that, I would have to go into like my previous text messages with them, or if they're like a Facebook friend or something like that, I would scroll back through their Facebook feed and try to find that stuff and populate it. And you're right, that's probably a 5-minute task or a 10-minute task. But the way I think about that is now I never have to do that again. And so now that work pays dividends for me in terms of, 3 to 5 meaningful touch points with that person who matters to me over the next 20 years of my life. And so that is something that I consider time well spent. Dex has like a Chrome plugin where it can automatically, like if you're on a LinkedIn profile, like say I had a call with somebody and I want to add them to my investor list or a future CMO list or whatever it is, I can go to their LinkedIn page and I click a button and it pops up a little thing to add them into Dex, and it populates all of their LinkedIn stuff. And then I can add them to my little group, and then I hit submit. And so that part's a lot easier to do. And then it's just discipline of like capturing notes. And so I keep, Dex open, or I keep Reflect open, or whatever it is. And I'm taking notes either during the call or right after the call to summarize next steps and things like that. So for the most part, I'm able to do it just kind of in the context of my normal life. But there is some setup, to your point. So that's a good question, Matthew. Similar, what does your day look like managing and maintaining all this? So that speaks to kind of the operating cadence piece. From a task management perspective, I live in things. I look at when I get up in the morning, I look at my calendar. I look at my most vital task for the day. I ask if that's still true. And then I tackle that first. And then I go into my anytime list if I don't have calendar date specific events throughout the rest of the day. That's how I manage that. As stuff comes up that doesn't fit that, like new inputs, I will log it into my inbox and things, and then I will process that later on. When I try to batch reading as much as I can. So if somebody sends me an interesting article or a podcast or whatever it is, I put it into Readrise Reader, and then I try to batch that for my weekend, like during my reading block, or for podcasts, it's like when I go for walks, that kind of thing. So I try to be present on what I'm focusing on as much as I can and batch those kinds of tasks. And then the synthesis piece for like knowledge management happens. Either I have a note for myself when I finish a physical book to go back in 2 weeks later and translate my notes into Reflect. When I create those unified theory documents, it's usually in response to a request from somebody. And so, or something I need to provide somebody else. So like if I have a meeting and we decide coming out of that meeting that we're going to go and test TikTok as a new channel, for example, I have a whole bunch of notes from stuff I've read in the past about how people use TikTok and things like that. I would go in and find that and consolidate it into a single page document that has all the actionable stuff in it. And then I share it with them, I make it public, and now I have it for future use. And then when previous stuff, it's just like I go in and for the most part, I can remember, oh, I have a standard operating procedure for your user manual, or how to run a one-on-one meeting, or how to create a great board deck, or whatever it is. And so I have a library in Notion, and I can keep most of that in my head. But if not, I can go in and just check in 2 seconds and see whether or not I have it or not have it. And then it's just copying and sending it over to them. So again, I think for the most part, it's able to it's able to happen in like the flow of my life. The habits are just getting better about defining what done means, getting better about identifying next actionable steps, getting better about taking notes. I think a lot of us are, if we're honest, aren't as disciplined about taking notes as we could be. And then where you're taking those notes depends on the tool that you're using. So if it's a call with somebody, and I have some next actions I need to do, I'll drop that into things. If it's just general notes, I'll drop it into decks and hit submit, and then set the next time when I want to follow up with them. If it's notes where I'm learning and enhancing knowledge management, I might create a page in Reflect to capture that information and create the link to that topic. But it kind of happens just sort of in the context of my day-to-day life. Curious how you see GPT intersecting with project management. It's a really good question. I have found that most helpful for me in the context of brainstorming. So like I mentioned, what does amazing look like? It can be in a fantastic jumping off point. So for example, my kids we just got back from Colorado visiting my parents. The kids start school next Wednesday. My wife and I had a glass of wine last night after the kids went to bed, and we asked ourselves, like, what do we want our fall to look like? What would an amazing fall look like? And we were just thinking of like random ideas. And I went into ChatGPT and I was like, hey, what are some fun fall activities that you could do with a family that are location agnostic? And it gave me a list of things. Some of them were dumb. Some of them were really useful. And so we added them to a list. And again, like this is an example here. I'm going to, let me see if I'm going to share, I'll share my Notion with you real quick, just to show you an example of what that looks like. How do I share again? Projects and checklists. So share screen, desktop 2. So you can see here, I mentioned the project page, templates, or wait, someday maybe, that's where it is. Things to do with the family. So here's things to do with the family that we just made. And that was just literally in 10 minutes yesterday, brainstorming and using kind of GPT to kind of augment it. But now I have this list. And so when we do our weekly review, which I do my weekly review actually with my wife, or at least partially with my wife, and we'll look at our schedule. And now I have a list of ready to go things of like, hey, we have a free night on Tuesday night. Is there something you want to do from this list to have a more meaningful fall or to make a more meaningful story with our family? And so I find that like getting in the habit of capturing and writing things down, again, in a place I can trust, makes it more helpful. I mentioned, like operation, I'm dealing with a lot of like hip and knee stuff. And so I have a project around fixing my body. My son is 13. And I realized that like, I think we would benefit from having some form of a rite of passage. And so I wrote down like, what do I want him to learn? And, what are some skills I want him to develop? And this was, again, just like brainstorming. But now I have a calendar entry to do I call it man school. And most of these things are kind of gender agnostic, but, like we're going to learn how to iron a shirt tonight, but by doing the work up front of kind of identify this stuff, it allows me to elevate up and kind of live more meaningful stories kind of on a day-to-day basis. So, but yeah, I think you could use GPT at a minimum to kind of facilitate brainstorming, especially around that question of like, what would amazing look like? So I think that's it. I know we went way over time, but
it's all good. It was great content. Yeah, I think we can wrap it up here. You already kind of shared your info. Yeah, if anybody is considering that cohort in January, I highly recommend it. I went through it this last January, so feel free, if you want to talk to someone who went through it, reach out to me. If not, I'd also recommend following Sean on LinkedIn. He's a great follow, good content. So with that being said, everyone, have a great day. We'll send the recording.
Appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining.